Hi everyone, it's William, and this is the 1921 Grand Duke Dmitri Diary series. And today we are no longer in Paris, we are in Copenhagen. But before we get to that, I want to return just for a minute to the activity that Dmitri was involved in Paris, with the sort of espionage dimension to it and his information bureau, and make of that what you will, as a sort of quixotic exercise or something serious. And he certainly was surrounding himself with serious people. But why were serious people buzzing around him? By which I mean not only, you know, people of note in the Russian community, people who had occupied very important positions like our friend Alexander Trepov and this Professor Lukyanov, but also non-Russian people and people with ties to espionage, people like Sidney Riley, for instance, who had himself initiated a meeting with Dmitri. And if you recall, a few diary entries ago, Dmitri had been invited by two people he didn't know to have lunch with them at the sort of Allies Club in Paris, so a club that had been established to bring important people from the various Allied countries together. And these were two military men. They were both naval men, oddly enough. One was the American naval attaché to France, and the other was an admiral who Dmitri identified as a French admiral who had been part of the whole naval activity around the Dardanelles during the war, and had been in Constantinople. And he'd given the man the name of Admiral Duprat, and I couldn't find any such person, and indeed no such person exists. But I now know who he was talking about. So he was talking about an admiral, a French admiral called Dumesnil. And Admiral Dumesnil was very much involved with the Russian community, especially those soldiers who had been evacuated to Constantinople. And there were thousands and thousands and thousands of them, and the French government had accepted responsibility for them and was feeding them, but the situation was simply untenable, and they were looking for places to send them. And in fact, they were supposed to be sending something like 5,000 of them to Brazil, but then the Brazilian government backed out, and they tried sending some to Corsica, and very few were deemed acceptable by the Corsican authorities. They wanted agricultural workers, and it was a huge mess. And as it turns out, Admiral Dumesnil was actually married to the daughter of one of the aristocratic houses in Imperial Russia, and he was very much involved as being sort of a liaison between the French government and General Wrangel, who was taking charge of these soldiers. They were his soldiers who'd been evacuated. And anyway, very interesting fellow, very interesting. And my breakthrough was finding some really interesting information about him in this book on the White Russian emigration. So, why were these men getting in touch with Dmitri? And my thought on that, more than anything else, is that they were simply sizing him up, because they were looking at him, England definitely, and possibly, apparently also France, the various Allied countries. They were looking at him as a potential figurehead and a potential future constitutional ruler of Russia. and he was more appealing in a lot of ways than any other member of the imperial family, although there was the little problem with the Rasputin assassination. But apparently they were not perceiving that as an obstacle. Whether the Russian people would have seen that as an obstacle or not, I don't know. The fact that Dmitri had been involved in that assassination. But at any rate, that's the conclusion I've come to so far, that they were simply sizing him up. To be their man in the case, or whether or not they wanted him to be their man in the case, in the event that something could be done in Russia to turn the tide of Bolshevism. Okay, so yes, we are in Copenhagen. We've jumped 2 weeks into the future, so we're going from the 31st of January to the 15th of February. These, of course, are dates on the old Russian calendar that Dmitri was still using. In Copenhagen itself, it was actually the 2nd of March, so it wasn't even February anymore. And where was Dmitri staying in Copenhagen? Well, he was staying at the English Mission. Why was he staying at the English Mission? Because his friends and surrogate parents, the Marlings, Sir Charles and Lady Lucia Marling, after they'd been recalled from Persia, from Tehran, where Dmitri had lived with them for longer than a year, they were sent to Denmark. So Sir Charles's next posting was to Denmark, to Copenhagen. Now, this was a complex relationship. So they had been there for Dmitri when nobody else was, when he was first exiled, and they had really been parents to him. Sir Charles had, let us say, he was in his 50s. Lucia was, I believe, in her late 30s, and that was more problematic because it's hard to be a mother to someone when you also are madly in love with him and want to have an affair with him. And so how far did that go? Well, Dmitri describes them basically making out, kissing and that sort of thing, but he says explicitly that it didn't go further than that. But, and Sir Charles, oddly, did not seem to mind this. There's no way he could have not known about it. There's just no way. It was going on under his own roof, and people were talking about it, but no matter how awkward or even humiliating that could have been for him, he never seems to have responded it that way. And if Lucia Marling was the woman that Dmitri describes her to be, she was very, very high maintenance, we would say nowadays, and very neurotic, in fact. She was a good woman in a lot of ways. She rolled her sleeves up like so many upper-class women did, and when there was illness, when there was, dysentery was spreading through Tehran, she was right there, helping and taking care of people. And indeed, she was doing the same thing in Copenhagen. She was really invaluable to the Russian refugees who made their way there. She was with the Red Cross, not as a nurse, but as someone trying to help refugees. But on the other hand, if even a fraction of what Dmitri describes is true, she was also just painfully neurotic, and she wanted to have him, Dmitri, under her thumb, and she would have fits of jealousy and, say, oh, you don't love me, and get very angry. And a couple of times he was just beside himself about what to do because he loved both the Marlings in his own way, and he would keep in touch with them until the end of Lucia's life. She died young. I think it was an automobile accident, and would continue to keep in touch with Sir Charles and also with their children. And he was very much en famille with them, and he never took that for granted. But Lady Lucia at times was a sort of millstone around his neck, and of course she wanted him to move to Copenhagen, and of course he didn't want to, and he was really happy to have the separation. But time has gone by now, and yeah, she's, I assume that the impetus for this was not Sir Charles, although he well, I'm sure he was happy to see Dmitri, but it was Lucia writing letter after letter and insisting that Dmitri come to Copenhagen, and he knows that he needs to, and he doesn't want to, but he does, and I'm getting much too far ahead, because that's not what he's talking about in this diary entry. In this diary entry, he is simply introducing us to Copenhagen. He's never been there before, and he's telling us about it. Okay. Already at the beginning of January, I had started thinking that I needed to go to Denmark to visit the Marlings, because in every letter they were asking and insisting that I immediately come and stay with them. I have to confess that I came here without feeling any particular desire. I really didn't want to leave Paris. Not at all because I like it there, but because it was a bore to undertake this rather complicated trip and go to a completely unknown place. But now that I've been here almost 2 weeks, I'm very glad to be here. My hosts, of course, are remarkably kind to me, in addition to which Danish society has welcomed me very kindly. And what between parties given by the Marlings and dinners out, the time passes awfully quickly, and I barely had one quiet dinner at home since I arrived. The city itself doesn't strike me as anything special. It really doesn't remind one much of Scandinavia, for example, Stockholm. It's a city of a generic European type with a German flavor. There are some beautiful old houses and palaces, but with rare exception they are either museums, like Rosenborg or Frederiksborg outside the city, or have been given up by their bankrupt owners, like the house in which the American mission is located or the house occupied by the Minister of Internal Affairs. Generally speaking, society is not big, or, more accurately, everyone does things together, so at almost all evening affairs you constantly meet the exact same people. That's very nice, because no matter where you go, the people are familiar. The weather is spoiling me. It's cold, much colder than in Paris or London, but clear and sunny almost all the time. So that is it for his introduction to his future readers on the physical aspects of Copenhagen, the city, and his first impressions on it. If you happen to be Danish or you live in Copenhagen and you're a little put out by what he says, well, just wait and see if his attitude changes about that. I suspect it might. Okay, so the Marlings we've talked about. I really sympathized with Dmitri in his lack of desire to just go on his own, not traveling with friends, and make this, as he says, rather complicated trip. And we know this about our friend, especially those of you who have been following along in the 1907 diary entries, that he doesn't like unfamiliar things. He doesn't like unfamiliar places, and he doesn't like to be around unfamiliar people. But once he gets there, and once he adjusts, he's glad he went, and yeah, everybody's nice to him. That's always a good thing. He's not talking yet about the people he's meeting or about his reception by Lady Lucia and if there's any tension there, but he will be. He just wants to give us the basics this time. Incidentally, not surprisingly, given that he's living at the English mission, he writes a little bit in English, so I'll reread the part that he wrote in English. And what between parties given by the Marlings and dinners out, the time passes awfully quickly, and I barely had one quiet dinner at home since I arrived. So he should have said, I have barely had one quiet dinner at home since I arrived, but that's okay. His English is overall pretty good. So, yeah, why did he know Stockholm and not Denmark? Well, he knew Stockholm because his sister had married a Swedish prince. And so he'd gone to spend time with her in Stockholm, and he'd gotten to know Sweden a little bit. It's funny that he never went to Denmark, because Denmark was where the Dowager Empress was from, And it was where, so I'm told, the family would go to these family reunions in Denmark every year, and it was where the various royals, British royals, Russian royals, what have you, it was where they could go and really feel relaxed and just let their hair down and enjoy themselves, and very much looked for, something that was looked forward to every year. But Dmitri never went, and this is just further confirmation of the fact that the household that he was part of, the household of Grand Duke Sergei and Grand Duchess Ella, away from the rest of the family in Moscow, they did not participate in things like this. They were fairly, by choice, isolated from the rest of the family. So Dmitri and Maria were too. Okay, so I guess he doesn't like the fact that these palaces, Rosenborg and Frederiksborg, are museums, but so it goes. I don't know why so many wealthy Danish homeowners had gone bankrupt, but that's the impression he gets anyway. If you have a chance to look up Rosenborg and Frederiksborg, I looked them both up, and they're very interesting, beautiful. They're still museums. They're very vertical compared to other royal palaces that I've seen. Okay, so yes, he likes Danish society because Danish society is small. It's a bit of a backwater, let's face it. It's not London or Paris. And he likes that he's seeing the same people all the time. He likes the weather because even though it's cold, it's sunnier and doesn't feel as cold as Paris and London. And at least when it comes to London, I can speak to that because I lived there almost 10 years, and my God, there's this cold north wind that I'm told comes from Siberia, and it just cuts through everything you wear. That was my impression of London anyway, that I was always cold, whereas, you know, when I was in Switzerland in the snow, in Davos specifically, which has a lot of sunshine, yeah, it was, according to the thermometer, it was colder than in London, but you felt the cold much less. I guess I better say goodbye now because my dog is starting, and it's hard to get him to stop once he gets started with his barking. So next time we'll be talking about Copenhagen, not from the perspective of buildings and society, but from the perspective of foreign relations, a very important way of assessing things for our friend Dmitri. So come back, and I'll see you then. Bye.